let me explain to you what's going on. All right, people are looking at the world. They're seeing fighting going on in Nicaragua. They're seeing a big war going on in Syria. They're seeing a whole situation going on in Yemen, bombing, civilians being killed. Chaos is taking place. They see the USA getting more and more hostile to both Russia and China. What's going on here? Well, I'm going to explain it with a phrase that I think pretty much sums it up. They want to keep the world poor. That's really what's going on here. They want to keep the world poor. Now, I know that might be a little bit confusing at first. People are like, what do you mean that they want to keep the world poor? Who is they? What are you talking about? Okay, let's back up, all right? Let's go case by case. Syria. Until 2011, Syria was one of the more prosperous countries in the Middle East. In 1981, about 42% of the population was illiterate. But according to the U.S. Library of Congress, by 1991, 10 years later, the Ba'ath Arab Socialist government had wiped out illiteracy in Syria. The Ba'ath Arab Socialist government of Syria, they built a huge hydroelectric power plant with the help of the Soviet Union. You know, they built this huge power plant and provided electricity and running water to the population. They engaged in huge amounts of construction. And in fact, in 2007, China started investing in Syria, and they started investing in oil and natural gas and building up a huge natural gas apparatus with the assistance from China. Just big efforts were made to raise the standard of living of the population, build up domestic industries, and kind of, build an economy in this impoverished Arab country. But now, everyone knows Syria is a mess, right? Refugees fleeing, huge swaths of territory in the country controlled by terrorists, mass, poverty and suffering, key infrastructure has been blown up, power plants destroyed, hospitals destroyed, schools destroyed. People are fearing for their lives, right? Syria was in the process of trying to make itself a more wealthy country with an independent government. Now, it's a mess. Nicaragua, Mike. Until 3 months ago, Nicaragua was the most prosperous country in Central America. They were having growth rates there that were just unprecedented, right? 5% GDP growth annually. They had the Sandinista government with the slogan of Christianity, socialism, and solidarity had reduced poverty by roughly 30%. They were seeing increases in the life expectancy. Even the World Happiness Index, that's a study done by the United Nations to determine what countries where people are being more satisfied with their lives, showed that in 2016, the greatest increase in happiness was in Nicaragua, where the socialist government, working with China and Russia, was building up infrastructure, enabling people to start their own businesses. They had a special program enabling craftsmen and indigenous people to open their own businesses. Nicaragua was doing very, very prosperously. It had an independent government, and unlike Guatemala, unlike Honduras and other countries throughout Central America, it was doing very, very well. And so now, all of a sudden, riots, Western media calling them revolutionaries, people running through the streets, tearing things up, blowing things up, killing people. Now, lo and behold, after 3 months of rioting, in which Western media was cheering for the rioters, in which American NGOs were funding what they called protests that involved, murdering police and all kinds of violence, right? So now, after 3 months of that, Nicaragua is wrecked, right? And their economy is ruined, and the socialist government of the Ortega, Rosario Murillo, they're trying to pick up the pieces and get things back to where they were. But they were the most prosperous country in Central America until about 3 months ago. Right? Look at this. This is a pattern here. Right? Yemen. A government comes to power, in the aftermath of kind of an ongoing uprising there. You have a new government, the Revolutionary Committee, comes to power on a platform that they want to utilize Yemen's oil reserves, its untapped oil deposits, start using that to develop the economy. That's what the Houthis are about. That's what the people in coalition with them, the Southern Movement, different forces, that's basically what the Revolutionary Committee that seized power in Yemen is saying. They're saying, look, we want to use our economy and we want to use our natural resources to make a more prosperous country in Yemen. In fact, on the logo of the Houthis, or the Ansar Allah group, they actually have a shaft of wheat. And I was explicitly told by people who are Yemeni that that shaft of wheat on their logo, along, parallel to the firearm and the hand representing God, it stands for economic development. That's what they're about. They're about economic development. Yemen is a deeply, deeply poor country, probably one of the poorest countries, if not the poorest country in the world, but they've got huge amounts of oil. And so the people of Yemen have been saying, why don't we use that oil? Why don't we just start selling it? Why don't we build up a prosperous country in Yemen? So that government seized control, and so now Saudi Arabia has been bombing and destroying Yemen with US-manufactured weapons, US-manufactured bombs, Pentagon generals advising them in Riyadh, blowing the country to shreds, basically. Why? Because they want to keep the world poor, okay? If a country develops itself, starts, selling its own oil on the international markets, starts producing its own steel and selling that on the international markets, they're a competitor, right? Let's go over the history of the 20th century real quickly, right? Beginning of the 20th century, Russia was one of the poorest countries in the Western world, in Europe, barely any manufacturing going on there. Come along, 5-year plans, 1928, the Soviet Union, Stalin mobilizes the population. Pretty soon, they're producing more steel at that point than any other country in the world. They've got the world's largest hydroelectrical power plant, the Dnepr Dam. The population is being mobilized, and they're just building like crazy. And the rest of the world is having a Great Depression in the 1930s. The rest of the world's having a Great Depression, but Russia goes from being a deeply impoverished country to being a global industrial superpower. China, right? 1949, China's the sick man of Asia. Deeply impoverished country, not a single steel mill. Well, they have a revolution, 1949. The Communist Party gets in there, they start building. Today, China produces half the steel in the entire world in their government-controlled steel industry. China has the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the entire world. At this point, China's producing the majority of the world's aluminum and the majority of the world's copper. The people in China, 700 million of them, have been lifted out of poverty. Right? So you have two, countries that used to be impoverished countries that became wealthy countries. This is what you have to understand. When the British went to India, and they colonized India, they didn't go there and look at those vast textile mills and looms that they had and say, wow, this is great, we're going to put you to work making some cloth for us. No, they burned down the looms and the textile mills of India and forced the people of India to start importing their cloth from Britain, right? Imperialism and monopolism and the rule of Wall Street is about keeping the world poor. It's about keeping the world in a situation where it is deeply poor. And when you're poor, you're dependent. When you're poor, you're not creating your own products, you have to import your products. When you're poor, you have to depend on Western corporations. When you're poor, they get to have a monopoly, a captive market, and they can charge you whatever price they want, and you're dependent on them, right? And that's what it's really about. It's about keeping Western corporations, Wall Street and London corporations, at the center of the world economy, so that everyone who wants to do business has to do it through them, through no transactions going on in which they don't make a profit. That's what it's all about. Right? Imperialism is basically forces based in the Western countries trying to keep the world poor so that they can stay at the center of the world economy. That's what it's really about. And whenever a country establishes an independent government, seizes control of its economy, whether it's Venezuela where they seized control of the oil, whether it's China where they seized control of the domestic manufacturing and began building, Nicaragua, they were working with China to build a canal to counter the Panama Canal. You can go down the line. Any country that seizes control of its economy and starts developing and building itself up gets attacked, gets bombed, destroyed, and attacked, right? The USA has no problem with Honduras. Honduras is a deeply impoverished country, one of the highest murder rates in the entire world. Very, very poor, but the US government and the Honduran government get along just fine because the people of Honduras are being kept in chronic poverty. They're not building themselves up, they're not developing, they're not a competitor, they're a captive market. And you go there and Honduras imports all kinds of American goods, buys from American corporations. Honduran corporations barely compete, barely exist almost. The domestic economy almost doesn't exist. It's just a captive market for Wall Street. Go to, Guatemala, similar story, right? But Nicaragua had established independence and was working with Russia and China to try and build itself up like Russia and China did during the 20th century. So now Nicaragua was being targeted. Syria had tried to build itself up, and so it was targeted. And now, hundreds of thousands of people are dead. The country's reduced to civil war because they want to topple a government that was trying to develop and make the country wealthier. This is what it's all about. It's about making the world poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich, can maintain a monopoly. And right now, the same thing that they did to these developing countries, keeping them in a state of chronic poverty, keeping it so they can't develop infrastructure, they're starting to do to countries in the Western world. I mean, we're seeing the deindustrialization of the United States. It's just disgusting. That's what's really going on here. Global monopoly capitalism. The rule of Wall Street and London bankers depends on keeping the world chronically poor.